I'm Brice of the Cinder Archive, and this is Chapter 7, The Long Road Between Jobs. They came home from the Brice with a captured captain, a scratched mark that almost belonged to the man who'd sent them looking for it, and a second-hand description of an unnervingly polite stranger who never once showed his face. 3 loose threads, none of them tied to anything yet, and an employer whose charm had for the first time run out half a second before he could find something to say. This is the chapter where the work gets quieter, where 5 people who fought a sky pirate together learn what it's like to simply travel together, ask questions together, and discover that the answer they're chasing belongs to nobody they expected. Settle in. The road is long, and not every important thing that happens on it happens loudly. Aetherglen does not stop being a city just because 5 of its newest hired hands have a job to do, and the job, this time, begins the unglamorous way every real investigation begins. Not with a fight, but with favors called in, doors quietly knocked on, and the particular patient work of people who know other people. There's no glamour in it, no rigging to climb or wind to fight through, only the slow accumulation of small truths traded in small rooms across a city that has never once cared whether the 5 of them succeed or fail at any of it. And a candlelit back room behind a steam laundry in the velvet ledger's quarter where the hiss and clank of the laundry's machinery covers conversations better than any amount of careful whispering ever could. Wick sits across a low table from a woman everyone in this trade simply calls Mags, older than Orish, sharper-tongued, and possessed of the specific, unsettling talent of seeming to listen with her whole body rather than just her ears. The room smells of lye soap and scorched starch, steam curling faintly under the door from the machinery beyond it, and Mags has never once, in all the years Wick's known her, bothered lighting more than a single candle to work by. "You're spending coin faster than usual this week," she says, by way of greeting, sliding a small dish toward him with 2 coins already waiting in it. "Hall work does that to people. Makes them generous right up until the job's done, and then suddenly stingy again the moment it isn't somebody else's purse anymore." "I'm not stingy!" "I'm efficient. You're tight as a miser's fist the day after payday, same as always, and we both know it." Mags's mouth twitches, the closest she ever comes to genuine amusement. "Featherlight, leg braces. Custom commission paid for in coin, nobody local recognizes. Delivered to a man who never once came to collect them in person. Sent a courier instead. Paid extra for the privacy of it." That's the rumor. 3 weeks stale, and probably missing pieces by now. Wren Hollow, if the courier's route means anything, which it usually does. Anything on the buyer himself? Quiet. Unremarkable by every account, which is exactly the kind of unremarkable that makes for an interesting rumor once you notice nobody can actually describe his face properly. People remember loud men and dangerous men without trying. They have to work to remember a man who's neither. Mags finally looks up, eyes pale and direct in the candlelight. "You're not after a criminal, Wick. Whatever this is, it isn't that. I've sold information on enough criminals to know the shape of one when it crosses my table, and this isn't it. Appreciate the editorial. You're paying for opinions, same as facts. Don't complain when you get both, and don't come back complaining if the opinion turns out to be the more useful half of what I sold you tonight." She pockets the second coin before he's even finished reaching for his coat, the transaction's natural end announced the way it always is between them. No further pleasantries needed, none particularly wanted. "One more thing," she adds as he reaches the door, not quite looking up from whatever she's already turned her attention to. "Whoever he is, he's not the only quiet one I've heard mentioned this month. Different rumor, different town, same flavor of unremarkable. Might be nothing, might be a pattern. I'll let you know which, if it ever becomes worth knowing." Wick pauses at that, but Mags has already gone back to her ledger, and he's learned, over the years, not to push her past the point where she's decided a conversation is finished. Across the city, in a record room at the Ashen Vow lined floor to ceiling with the kind of leather-bound correspondence ledgers that only a hall obsessed with documentation could ever produce, Senna sits with Sister Maeve, a thin, soft-spoken archivist whose entire professional life consists of tracking reports of unregistered magistrate across the region, one tedious filed complaint at a time. The room smells of dust and binding glue, lamplight pooling close and warm over the table since the high windows here are kept shuttered against the sun that would otherwise fade the ink. You're fortunate I had this filed under the right season, Maeve says, drawing a thin ledger from a shelf with the practiced economy of a woman who's cataloged thousands of these pages without ever once losing her patience for the work. Most reports this vague get buried within the month. This one I kept, mostly because it didn't read like the others. There's a sighting from Wren Hollow, she continues, sliding the page across the table, her voice pitched for a room that spent decades teaching people to speak quietly in it. A resident reported moving with sudden, unaccountable vigor. Not magic in any registered sense. Just unusual enough that a neighbor felt compelled to file it through proper channels rather than simply gossip about it over a fence. We get dozens like this season. Most are nothing. A man finds a good walking stick, a woman recovers from an illness faster than expected, and somebody overreacts out of boredom. This one sat unresolved for 3 weeks, which is longer than most, because nobody assigned a follow-up ever quite got around to it. Do you have a name? A nickname? More than a name, the kind small towns use for everyone, regardless of how well they actually know them. Locals call him Eamon. Eamon Druce. Maeve closes the ledger, folding her hands atop it with the subtle patience of someone who has filed 1,000 reports, and expects this one to resolve exactly as unremarkably as all the rest. For what it's worth, the report reads more like concern than suspicion. Whoever filed it seemed worried for him, not about him. I noted that specifically, in case it ever mattered to anyone reading this file after me. I rather suspect it just did. Thank you for keeping it, Senna says, meaning it more than the simple courtesy of the word suggests. It's the job. Most of what I file never matters to anyone again. It's nice once in a while to be wrong about that. Maeve's smile is brief, tired, genuine. Go gently with him, whoever he turns out to be. The report asks for help, not justice. I'd hate to see that distinction lost on the way there. I'll try to remember that, Senna says, even if it turns out to be more complicated than it sounds right now. It always does. Maeve returns the ledger to its shelf with the same unhurried care she'd taken removing it, sliding it home between 2 others that look, to Senna's eye, entirely indistinguishable from it. That's rather the whole trouble with filing things away neatly, Knight. The world insists on being messier than the ledger allows for. Best any of us can do is keep good records and hope somebody reads them with the right intentions when the time comes. And in a smoke-stained garrison tavern at the city's outer edge, where the ale is cheap and the company is exclusively the kind that served somewhere uniformed once and has the scars to prove it, Brom sits across a scarred wooden table from a barrel-chested old soldier the regulars all call Pike, who served, as it happens, in the very same unit Brom once did, a lifetime and a war ago. The tavern smells of spilled ale and old pipe smoke, the low rumble of a dozen separate conversations providing exactly the kind of cover to old soldiers need to talk shop, without anyone else paying attention. Didn't expect to see you in here again so soon, Pike says, pouring them both a second round without being asked. Twice in one season's practically a habit for you. Needed information, not nostalgia. Can't a man have both? Pike grins, easy and unbothered, the grin of a man who's earned the right to needle his old sergeant a little and knows it. Wren Hollow, he says, once Bram's laid out what little he knows. Quiet town. Mining stock mostly, a few too many old injuries for its size, the way these border towns always end up once the seams run thin, and the work gets harder for less return. There's talk of a fella out there who used to walk like the rest of us walk after 30 years underground, bent, slow, the kind of pain you can see from across a room, and now doesn't. Walks fine. Better than fine, some say, though nobody's seen exactly how he manages it, and the ones who've asked outright say he goes quiet and changes the subject rather than answer. Soldier? Minner, last I heard. But you know how these stories travel, Bram. By the time it reaches a tavern this far from Wren Hollow, half the details have already changed hands twice, and the other half were never quite right to begin with. Pike studies his old comrade for a long moment, something fond and faintly worried in the look. You're still doing this work, then? Hired blade work after everything. Pays better than mining? Most things do. Pike doesn't push further, the particular courtesy of one old soldier extended to another, and lets the conversation move on to safer ground. Old names, old jokes, the comfortable shorthand of men who shared worse nights than this one, and don't need to say so aloud to feel it sitting between them. A tarnished unit standard hangs above the bar, the same one Bram remembers from a lifetime ago, faded enough now that the colors barely register against the smoke-darkened wood behind it, and his eyes drift to it more than once over the course of the second round, without either of them remarking on it. "You ever think about coming back to something like this?" Pike asks eventually, nodding vaguely at the tavern, the regulars, the whole worn, comfortable shape of the life he's built here. Stadier work than chasing strange men through mining towns for a genius nobody fully trusts? Thought about it? Brum finishes his ale. Doesn't fit anymore. Spent too long learning how to be useful to people who actually need it. Hard to go back to pulling pints for men who mostly just need company. Company's underrated. Pike's grin returns, easy as ever. But I'd take your point. Go on then. Go be useful. Just come back through when you've got a night to spare for something that isn't business. I will. You won't, but I appreciate the lie. Pike claps him once on the shoulder, the gesture of two men who said their real goodbyes to each other a long time ago and have simply been finding excuses to repeat the smaller version ever since. By the time the three of them reconvened that evening at a quiet corner table in a tavern, none of them particularly cared to name in advance Wick's rumor, Maeve's filed report, Pike's tavern gossip, 3 separate threads pulled from 3 separate corners of the city. The shape of where they're going has assembled itself with unsettling speed. 3 sources who've never met, who serve entirely different masters and trade in entirely different currencies, have somehow each arrived independently at the same quiet corner of the map, Wren Hollow, a mining town 3 days' travel from Aetherglen, and a man named Eamon Druce who shouldn't, by any account anyone can offer, be walking as well as he apparently now does. That's either a very small coincidence, Wick says, laying his own findings down beside the other two, or no coincidence at all. It's not a coincidence, Senna says. 3 networks, 3 different kinds of people, all pointing at the same name inside the same week. Whatever's happening in Wren Hollow, it's not exactly subtle, even if the man himself apparently tries to be. Nobody disagrees, and the matter is settled well before any of them have finished their drinks. Ha! The carriage they've chartered for the road to Wren Hollow is cramped, practical, and entirely too small for 5 people. 2 days' supplies, and the particular tension that's been building since Wick mentioned, almost in passing, exactly how he'd gotten Mags talking so quickly. You threatened her, Senna says, not quite a question. I reminded her of an old debt. Gently. Wick doesn't look up from the route map he's pretending to study with great interest. Nobody got hurt. Nobody got threatened with anything worse than an awkward conversation about an unpaid favor from 3 years ago. That's still leverage. That's still using fear to get what we want, even if you've dressed it up as a debt instead of a fist. Calling it leverage makes it sound more dramatic than it actually was. I sat across the table from a woman who likes me well enough and reminded her she owed me something. That's not fear, Senna. That's just how grown adults conduct business with each other, when neither one of them has any particular reason to trust the other out of pure goodwill. It's still not honest. It's exactly as honest as it needs to be. Wick finally looks up properly, and there's an edge under the lightness now. Faint but real. You want to know how Bram's tavern friend talked so freely? Old loyalty were shared. Decades of trust that took 2 men risking their lives together to build. You want to know how Maeve talks so freely to you? The vow's reputation, an oath, the weight of an institution behind every word you said to her. I don't have any of that built up anywhere. I never have. What I've got instead is favors, debts, the occasional implied consequence for not paying them. And it works exactly as well as your reputation works for you. It's just considerably less comfortable to watch from the outside. That doesn't make it right. Didn't say it was right. Said it was how it works. He holds her gaze a beat longer than either of them is fully comfortable with. I'm not going to apologize for being good at the only thing I was ever actually taught how to be good at, Senna. Not even to you. Not even now, when it's gotten us exactly the information we needed in half the time your methods or Brahms would have managed alone. I'm not asking you to apologize. I'm asking you to notice it costs something, even when it works. That lands differently than her first objection did. Wick opens his mouth to answer, closes it again, and for a moment something genuinely uncertain crosses his face before the easy mask reasserts itself. Maybe it does, he allows, finally, quieter than anything else he said since the conversation started. It doesn't mean I know a better way to do my half of this job. If you've got one, I'm listening. Senna doesn't. Not really. Not yet. And the honesty of not having an answer sits between them rather more uncomfortably than the argument itself did, the carriage rattling on in the silence that isn't quite settled and isn't quite hostile either, just unresolved the way most real disagreements actually are. She turns to look out the window for a while, watching the countryside slide past, and finds herself wondering, not for the first time this week, whether the oath she spent her whole life training toward has rather more gray in it than the hall's training yard ever let on. Bram, watching the exchange from the opposite bench with his usual unreadable patience, says nothing at all, though something in the set of his jaw suggests he's filing this particular friction away, alongside everything else he's been quietly cataloging since Chapter 1. Orsa, beside him, watches the passing road instead, visibly more interested in trees than in refereeing an argument that isn't hers to settle. The road to Wren Hollow unspools the way long roads always do. Slowly, then all at once, 3 days compressing themselves into a handful of memories nobody will bother recording properly later. The first day passes mostly in the carriage's cramped, lingering quiet, Senna and Wick's argument settling into something unspoken, rather than resolved. They reach the last proper way station by midday on the 2nd, a low timber building at a crossroads that exists for no purpose beyond feeding travelers and trading tired horses for fresher ones, and it's here the carriage gets left behind. The driver paid handsomely to wait out their business in Wren Hollow rather than risk the narrowing road any further, and visibly relieved, if his tip is any indication, not to be asked to go on. The station master, a broad, cheerful woman entirely unbothered by 5 strangers arriving with no luggage beyond what fits on a saddle, sells them 5 serviceable horses at a price Wick spends a full 10 minutes negotiating down out of pure habit rather than any real need, while Orsa disappears to introduce herself properly to each animal in turn before anyone's allowed to mount, murmuring something low and private to each one that none of the others quite catch, and none of them ask her to repeat. You really do this every time, Wick says, watching her work down the line. Every time, Orsa confirms, without looking up. A horse that trusts you carries you better than one that merely tolerates you. Cost nothing but a few minutes, and I've never once regretted spending them. Cost us 20 minutes at the last 3 stables, and saved us considerably more than that the one time a frightened horse very nearly put Brom through a fence post instead of over it. I'd call that an excellent trade. Brom, mounting without comment, neither confirms nor denies the fence post incident, though the look he gives Orsa suggests there's a story there. Nobody's quite ready to tell yet either. It's on horseback, somewhere in the empty stretch of the 2nd day, that Thompson finally finds something to do with her restless hands, besides fidgeting with her own sleeve. Bram, riding alongside her without much ceremony, hands over a worn whetstone and the dullest of his spare blades, and simply says, "Might as well learn something useful while we ride," and spends the better part of an hour teaching her the proper angle, without once making her feel foolish for not already knowing it. It's a small thing. It isn't nothing, either. The first real one-on-one time that 2 of them have spent together since the posting first went up, and Thompson finds herself unexpectedly grateful for the distraction of it, for an afternoon where the only thing she has to think about is the rasp of stone against steel, and Bram's patient, infrequent corrections. Wick, for his part, spends the same stretch of road needling Orsa about her continued, deeply principled refusal to ride anything she hasn't personally introduced herself to first. A habit that's cost them a solid 20 minutes at every stable since Aetherglen, and shows no sign of softening regardless of how often Wick points out that the horse, in fact, does not care about manners. Orsa responds to this needling with the placid, unbothered patience of a woman who has outlasted considerably more persistent irritants than one tiefling rogue with opinions about livestock etiquette, and by the 2nd day, even Wick seems to have made a grudging kind of peace with losing that particular argument every single time. They make camp that evening at a turn in the road, where a stream cuts close enough to refill canteens, and a fire goes up the practiced way it always does now. Brom building it, Orsa pointedly not commenting on the wastefulness of an open flame, she'd have managed with half the smoke, Tamsin already half asleep against her own pack, before the food's even finished cooking, Senna and Wick keeping careful companionable distance from each other, that neither of them comments on either. Supper is the usual road fare: salt meat, hard bread, a stew. Orsa insists on improving with whatever she's foraged along the day's route, despite nobody asking her to, and for a while the only real conversation is the easy, low-stakes kind that's grown comfortable between them over the past week. Wick complaining at length about the carriage's suspension, Tamsin cheerfully informing him that the suspension is the least of the carriage's structural failings, and listing several others with clinical enthusiasm, Rom eating in silence, and in looking for 1 by fitfires by take down. Even Senna laughs, once, at some particularly dry observation of Orsa's about city-bred horses and their opinions of perfectly ordinary mud, and whatever tension lingered from the carriage ride seems to have settled, for now, into something closer to ordinary road-weariness than genuine friction. It's well into the second watch, the fire burned down to coals and the others properly asleep, when Bram speaks first, unprompted, which is itself enough of an event that Orsa, keeping the watch beside him, goes very still rather than risk interrupting whatever's finally decided to surface. "I held rank once," he says, turning a worn strap of old leather over in his hands, the kind of absent fidgeting a man does when his mouth is doing something his hands need distraction from. Sergeant, then acting captain, near the end. Crown levy, border conflict, nothing the history books bothered remembering properly. We were good. Better than good, best unit in the whole levy by every measure anybody bothered tracking. I'd have told you back then that rank was just recognition catching up to work already done. Didn't take me long to learn better. He doesn't look up from the strap. Command above us made a call once that didn't need making. Political call. Wanted a particular hill held for a particular show of force, for reasons that had everything to do with appearances back in the capital, and nothing to do with what actually needed holding militarily. I argued against it. Laid out the ground, the numbers, everything a sergeant's supposed to lay out when he thinks an order's a mistake. Lost the argument, the way you always lose an argument with someone who outranks you by enough rungs that your objection reads as insubordination before it ever gets treated as analysis. A long pause, the fire popping once in the quiet. We held the hill. Held it for exactly as long as the show of force required, and then a column came through that nobody'd warned us about, because nobody in the capital had thought it worth the effort of finding out, and we lost 11 people defending ground that didn't matter to anyone except a handful of men in a city who never once set foot on it. I'm sorry, Orsa says. Quiet, genuine. Wasn't your call to make. Wasn't mine either in the end, which is rather the point. Bram sets the strap down at last. I could have climbed after that, easily. Ironbreaker Hall doesn't care much what you did before you walked through its doors, only what you can do once you're inside them, and I could do plenty, still can. Offered rank twice since I joined. Turned it down twice. Once you've watched 11 people die so a handful of men far away could feel like they'd accomplished something, rank stops looking like an achievement and starts looking like exactly what it actually is. A license to make that same call again someday, when it's someone else's 11 people on the line and somebody's asking you to weigh appearances against lives. So you stayed at the bottom on purpose. Stayed where nobody could hand me that particular kind of decision again. Different thing entirely from staying at the bottom. He meets her eyes for the first time since he started talking, something steady and entirely without self-pity in the look. Most people read it as failure. Man who could have climbed and didn't. Must be something wrong with him. Soft somewhere. Lacking ambition. I've stopped correcting people about it years ago. Doesn't cost me anything to let them think what they think, and explaining the real reason just invites questions I'd rather not keep answering. It would cost most people something, Orsa says. Pride, if nothing else. Pride's expensive. I'd rather spend mine on something that matters. A faint, almost smile, the first genuine warmth Bram's shown all evening. You're the first person on this whole job who's asked instead of assumed, by the way. Wasn't planning on telling anyone this part. Don't know why I'm telling you. Except that you're easy to talk to precisely because you don't seem to need anything from the answer. Because I wasn't going to ask, Orsa says simply. You don't talk to people who corner you for a story. You talk, eventually, to the ones patient enough not to. 50 years alone in the wild teaches you that much, if nothing else. Most living things, given enough quiet and enough patience, eventually tell you what's actually wrong with them. You just have to be willing to wait longer than most people are. The other four don't know any of this. Wick knows there's a war in there somewhere. Everyone who's spent a week around me figures that much out. None of them know the hill, or the 11 names I still know by heart, or why I turned the rank down twice instead of once, which would have at least looked like a single bad day rather than a settled choice. Brahm turns the strap over once more, slower now. Doesn't seem like the sort of thing you bring up over breakfast. Most true things aren't. Orsa watches the coals for a while before adding, quieter, you could tell them. When it's time. Bram Coldiron, who once held rank and gave it back twice, isn't a smaller man than the one they think they know. He's a considerably larger one. They'd see that if you let them. Maybe. He doesn't sound convinced, but he doesn't sound close to it either, which from Bram is nearly the same thing as agreement. Maybe not yet. Yet's a fine word. I've built an entire life around it. Orsa allows herself something that's almost a smile, brief and dry. I'll grant you this much. 11 names, kept that carefully, that long, says rather more about the man holding them than any rank ever could have. Bram doesn't answer that, but the silence that follows is a comfortable one, the kind two people share when something true has finally been said and doesn't need any further commentary to land properly. He picks the strap back up after a while, working it absently between his fingers again, and Orsa lets the quiet hold for as long as it wants to. He's, a little apart from the fire, close enough to feel its warmth but far enough to talk without an audience. Orsa finds Thompson sitting with her knees drawn up, staring at nothing in particular. The conversation with Brahm still settling somewhere behind them both. The night air out here is cleaner than anything Aetherglen ever offers, cold and faintly sharp with wood smoke, and for a moment Orsa simply stands there, letting the quiet do some of the work before she says anything at all. You've been quiet about your bloodline since the day we met, Orsa says, without much preamble. Because preamble has never once been her instinct and isn't about to become one now. I don't ask out of idle curiosity. 5 decades of watching things grow and rot has taught me to recognize a wound that hasn't finished healing when I see one. Yours has been showing for a while now, in the way you hold your sleeve down even in summer, in the way you change the subject before anyone's even finished the question. It's a gentle question, by any reasonable measure, direct but not unkind, the sort of thing one careful person asks another careful person when there's genuine concern behind it, rather than mere nosiness. There's nothing to tell, Thompson says, too fast, too flat, the words coming out sharper than the question warranted by a margin wide enough that she hears it herself a half-second after it's already left her mouth. My family doesn't discuss it. I don't discuss it. It's not a story, Orsa. It's just how I was born. People don't owe explanations for how they were born. No, Orsa agrees evenly, not flinching from the sharpness at all. They don't. The silence afterwards stretches longer than either of them seems entirely comfortable with, and Thompson, looking down at her own hands, at the place beneath her sleeve where copper waits, quiet and unlit, for the next time she'll need it, finds herself oddly unsteadied by her own reaction, like she's just watched someone else's hand slam a door she didn't know was still capable of slamming this hard. That came out harder than I meant it to, she says, eventually, quieter now. I noticed. Orsa doesn't push the opening, doesn't ask the follow-up question that's plainly sitting right there waiting to be asked. She simply settles back against the log behind her, giving the moment room to be exactly as small or as large as Thompson needs it to be tonight. I'm not going anywhere if you ever do want to tell it properly. I'm also not going anywhere if you never do. Both are fine answers, far as I'm concerned. Thank you, Thompson says, and means it, though she still can't quite explain to herself why a perfectly reasonable question from a woman she trusts had managed to land like an accusation instead of the simple curiosity it plainly was. For what it's worth, Orsa adds after a moment, almost offhand, studying the dark tree line rather than Thompson's face, the things we won't talk about are usually the things that talk loudest anyway, just not in words. I've learned to listen for the other kind. What does mine say then? Thompson asks, half a challenge, half something closer to genuine frightened curiosity. Since you're listening. Orsa considers the question with real care before answering, the kind of pause that suggests she's weighing honesty against kindness and trying to find the angle that serves both. That it's older than you are, she says finally, and that you spent your whole life being told to be quiet about it before you ever had the chance to decide for yourself whether quiet was the right answer. A pause. I could be wrong. I usually try to leave room for that. Thompson doesn't answer, but something in her shoulders loosens, fractionally, the particular release of a person who's just been seen a little more clearly than they expected to be, and found, against all instinct, that it didn't hurt the way they thought it would. Neither of them mentions it again that night, but Orsa, walking back toward the fire some time later, finds herself turning the moment over with the same patient, watchful attention she'd give, a wound that's healed crooked, not pressing on it, not yet, but no longer able to look away from the fact that it's there. They lay the gathered intelligence out properly the next morning, spread across a flat stone near the dying campfire. Mags's rumor of featherlight leg braces, Mabe's filed report of unaccountable vigor, Pike's tavern talk of a miner who shouldn't walk this well, all of it converging, with uncomfortable precision, on one quiet mining town, and one ordinary name. None of it fits, Senna says, turning the assembled notes over for what's easily the third time, frustration plain in the set of her shoulders. Every rival we've been told to expect is some flavor of criminal, profiteer, smuggler, somebody making a living off stolen tech. This is a miner? A miner with a filed concern report from a worried neighbor, not a wanted poster. Maybe he stole it and just hasn't been caught yet, Wick offers, though even he doesn't sound especially convinced by his own suggestion, turning one of Mags's coins over between his fingers out of pure habit. Maybe, Bram says, or maybe Geary's dangerous unregistered majestat was never really about who's dangerous. Maybe it was just about where his work ended up, regardless of who's wearing it. He taps the report for Maybe. She said the neighbor sounded worried for him, not about him. That's not how you describe a threat. That's how you describe somebody you're scared is about to get hurt. So what is he? Thompson asks, quiet, voicing the question that's plainly sitting underneath everyone's careful circling phrasing. If he's not a criminal, and he's not dangerous in the way Geary made it sound, what exactly are we walking into? Nobody has a clean answer for that, and the honest not knowing sits in the morning air a while, uncomfortable in a way none of their previous targets quite managed to be. Even Voss, venal and dangerous as he'd been, had made a kind of sense, a businessman doing business exactly as advertised. This doesn't make sense yet, and the not making sense of it settles over the five of them like weather they can't quite dress for. There's a version of this where we don't go at all, Wick says, half testing the idea even as he says it, watching for reactions. Send word back to Geary. Tell him this one doesn't fit the brief, let him decide whether it's still worth the trouble. And if he says yes regardless, Bram asks. We're 3 days closer to Wren Hollow than we are to Aetherglen, turning around Cassis nearly as much as finishing the ride. Maybe the mission's simpler than we're making it, Senna offers, without much conviction. Recover the tech, regardless of who's wearing it or why. That's still the job, isn't it? It doesn't have to mean anything more complicated than that. It's already meaning something more complicated than that, Orsa says, not unkindly, folding the last of the notes away. Whether we want it to or not. We won't know what exactly until we see him. Speculating further just spends daylight we could be spending on the road. Nobody argues with that either, and within the hour they're packed, mounted, and moving again, Wren Hollow somewhere ahead of them at the end of what's left of the day's road, every one of them carrying some version of the same unanswered question, without quite saying so aloud, the easy momentum of the past 2 days' investigation, settling, gradually, into something quieter and more watchful as the miles pass. Nafta, the last stretch of road into Wren Hollow runs through increasingly hilly country, scrub pine giving way to the low gray spoil heaps that mark a mining town's outskirts, long before the town itself comes into view. The air taking on a faint mineral tang that has nothing in common with Aetherglen's brass and rift atmosphere, and everything in common with simple, honest dirt. Senna rides a little apart from the others for most of the final afternoon, turning Wick's words from 2 days ago over without quite meaning to. I don't have any of that built up anywhere. I never have. She isn't sure by the time the first spoil heaps come into view whether she's angrier at the method or simply uncomfortable at how well it had worked, and she isn't sure either answer reflects especially well on her. Wick, riding near the back of the group with Tamsin for company, seems lighter than he has all week, pointing out increasingly improbable shapes in the distant spoil heaps for her benefit. A sleeping dragon, a collapsed cathedral, a particularly judgmental-looking horse, until even Tamsin, distracted from her own thoughts despite herself, admits that one of them genuinely resemble a horse, and a disapproving one at that. It's a small, easy kindness, the sort Wick rarely announces as such, and Tamsin finds herself grateful for it without quite saying so. They reach the edge of Wren Hollow on the evening of the third day, the town settling into the kind of modest, lamplit quiet that small mining settlements always seem to fall into once the day's work is done. Low stone houses, a scatter of mine cart tracks running off toward dark hills, smoke rising thin and orderly from a dozen chimneys against a sky just beginning to bruise toward dusk. There's nothing here that looks like trouble. No fortified walls, no suspicious crowds, nothing but ordinary people finishing an ordinary day, and the 5 of them sit their horses at the edge of it for a moment longer than strictly necessary, none of them quite ready to ride in and start asking questions that might break something none of them can name yet. It's Tamsin who sees him first, purely by chance, glancing toward a side lane where a single figure makes slow, halting progress between a well and a doorway some 30 yards distant, bent at the shoulder, each step visibly, painfully deliberate, the unmistakable gait of a body that spent decades being asked to do more than it can comfortably give. "There," she says, low, and the rest of the party follows her gaze in time to watch the man pause at his own door, set down whatever he's carrying, and reach for something just inside it. What happens next happens quickly enough that none of them are fully prepared for it. The man straightens. Not slowly, not with effort, but all at once, the bent, halting posture simply falling away like a coat shrugged off, and when he turns back toward the well to retrieve whatever he'd left there, he moves with a fluid, unhurried grace that has nothing whatsoever in common with the walk that brought him to that doorway 30 seconds earlier. A faint mechanical whir carries across the evening distance, barely audible, gone again the moment he stops moving. He crosses the short yard, retrieves a second pail, and turns back toward his door again, and the whole transformation, pain to ease, halting to fluid, happens so completely that it's almost possible to believe the first version of him was the lie, and this one the truth, except that everyone watching knows, with absolute certainty, that it's the other way around. Nobody says anything for a long moment. Even the horses seem to sense something in the stillness, shifting uneasily beneath their riders. "That's not a man who stole something to hurt people with it," Senna says finally, very quietly, more to herself than to any of them. "That's a man who stole something so he could stand up straight." "Doesn't make it any less stolen," Bram says, though there's none of his usual flatness in it. More like a man stating a fact he wishes weren't still true. "No," Senna agrees, "it doesn't. But it changes what we're supposed to feel about taking it back from him, doesn't it? Wick, uncharacteristically, has nothing clever to offer. He simply watches the man finish his small evening chores, set his pails by the door, and disappear inside, the lamplight in his window glowing warm and entirely ordinary against the gathering dark, the same as every other lit window up and down the lane. "He looked happy," Thompson says after a while, almost surprised by her own observation. "Just now, when he was moving easily, not triumphant, not dangerous. Just, happy. The way you look when something that's hurt you for a long time finally stops hurting, even for a minute. That's the part Gary's posting never mentioned," Orsa says. "Funny how much a job can leave out and still call itself a full account." Nobody argues with any of it, and the 5 of them watch from the edge of town a while longer, in a silence that has nothing to do with tactics, and everything to do with 5 strangers quietly, separately deciding that whatever they came here to do, it isn't going to feel anything like the fight at the Brass Feathers rigging, and that this time, before any of them draws a weapon, somebody is going to have to find the right words first.